Please note today's session is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Thank you very much, and on behalf of the National Cancer Institute, I wish to welcome everyone to the April Advanced Topics in Implementation Science webinar. Today we are delighted to welcome our presenter, Dr. Byron Powell. He will be joined by our own Dr. David Chambers to moderate the session. A very brief word about logistics and we'll be off. We ask that you, if you're not already on mute, to please keep your phone on mute for the duration of today's presentation. As mentioned, the session is being recorded and muting all lines will help us to avoid any background noise. We encourage questions. They can be submitted using the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of your screen. Type your question in the provided Q&A field and hit submit. Feel free to submit your questions at any time, but we will be opening the session for questions when the presentation is finished. Without any further ado, it's my pleasure to turn the meeting over to Dr. David Chambers.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and big thanks to Byron Powell for being willing to lead us through a lot of wonderful work that he's done trying to provide resources for the field around implementation strategies. I remember meeting Byron when he was a grad student at Washington University St. Louis, working with Enola Proctor, who many of you know as one of our leading lights in implementation science. And Byron, from pretty much day one, started to make tremendous contributions as a grad student, trying to help us all think through how do we do a better job of systematically capturing the evidence as well as the different strategies that are being used toward implementing a range of evidence-based practices. And it's been wonderful to see not only that he's been responsible for some of the key recent papers in the field, but that he's continued his work as he's moved from grad school into his current role as an assistant professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management in the Gilling School of Global Public Health at UNC Chapel Hill. So we don't want to take any more time away from what we understand and have sort of a preview of a great presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to Byron, but just echoing what Sarah had said, please feel free as questions come up to send them, and as soon as Byron concludes his component of the presentation, we'll try and get through as many different questions as we can. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Byron, and again, thank you for what you're about to give to us.
Thank you, David, for that introduction, and thank you to Sarah and the rest of your team for the opportunity to present. We're thrilled to present some of this work on implementation strategies here today, and excited for this upcoming series focusing on implementation strategies. I want to begin by acknowledging a host of collaborators, and I won't name them all by name and embarrass them, but do want to call out Enola Proctor at Washington University and Curtis McMillan at the University of Chicago, who were really instrumental in some of the early studies that I'm going to share today, as well as Tom Waltz and Joanne Kirchner at Eastern Michigan University and the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, respectively, for being the co-PIs of the ERIC study, which I'm going to share about here in a minute. So just to begin by sharing some initial definitions to make sure that we're on the same page, implementation science is defined as the scientific study of methods to promote the systematic uptake of research findings and other evidence-based practices into routine practice. And it includes the study of influences on healthcare professional and organizational behavior. So I like to think of the two components of implementation science as really being implementation strategies and then the determinants of change, or the barriers and facilitators to change at multiple levels. We've defined implementation strategies as methods or techniques used to enhance the adoption, implementation, and sustainability of a clinical program or practice, or the how of implementation. And I want to note quickly here that there are many terms that are used for the specific implementation strategies, as I'm going to note in a minute. But even for the term implementation strategies, some people may call them knowledge translation strategies or knowledge translation interventions, implementation techniques, implementation interventions, and so on and so forth. So I think many of those terms are really speaking to the same construct. We've differentiated between different types of implementation strategies. So we talk about in our work discrete implementation strategies, which involve single actions or processes, such as instituting a system of reminders or an educational workshop. And we differentiate that from multifaceted implementation strategies. We know that given the multiple challenges in implementation, strategies often need to be multifaceted and often multi-level to address barriers to change. And so multifaceted strategies involve a combination of multiple discrete strategies, such as training plus reminders, or a host of other combinations. We also talk about blended implementation strategies, which are multifaceted implementation strategies that have been protocolized and often branded in some way. So for instance, Charles Glisson and colleagues at the University of Tennessee have an organizational change intervention that is really intended to change organizational culture and climate in ways that facilitate the uptake of evidence-based practice, and that's called the Availability, Responsiveness, and Continuity, or ARC intervention. Similarly, Greg Ahrens at the University of California, San Diego has a Leadership and Organizational Change intervention, or LOCI, which is really a package of discrete strategies that have been, again, protocolized and branded in a way that is identifiable. So I'm going to share a few studies that really we've conducted to develop a compilation of implementation strategies. And the initial question that we started with was just a simple question of what strategies can be used to implement effective clinical interventions. And this started with a team of investigators at Washington University that was comprised of social work researchers and health services researchers, as well as emergency medicine physicians. And when we turned to the literature, the first problem that we encountered was a real lack of conceptual clarity. The literature was actually characterized as a Tower of Babel. Multiple strategy terms were used inconsistently. So sometimes the same term would be used to describe very different strategies, and at other times very similar strategies would be characterized by completely different terms. So it's sort of difficult to get a handle on the literature. The other challenge with the literature in terms of conceptual clarity is that strategies, much like other interventions, are often poorly described, and so they're not described in sufficient detail to actually allow researchers or other stakeholders to replicate them in research or practice. The other problem that we saw from the compilations and lists that we were aware of is several of them seem to present somewhat of a limited menu of options for implementation stakeholders. And so one of our interests was to sort of expand that menu of available options. The first study we conducted was a structured review of the literature and primarily focusing on the mental health and health literatures. And we began by first examining compilations and lists that we were aware of, as well as some of these blended models that we were aware of and could find in the literature, and actually culling out the discrete strategies that we could find listed there or included in these blended implementation strategies. We supplemented that with a database search and an expert query, which was primarily in the editorial board of Implementation Science, which is the open access journal in the field. And ultimately, we published a compilation of 68 discrete implementation strategies, which was originally published in Medical Care Research and Review. And we categorized these strategies in these 6 buckets. So we had several strategies that focused on planning, such as strategies that focused on gathering information, building buy-in, and developing relationships and things of that nature. Certainly, there were many strategies focusing on education and developing education materials, disseminating education materials. There were a number of strategies focusing on financing and financial concerns. There were also strategies that focused on restructuring either the physical environment or restructuring clinical teams in ways that would facilitate implementation. And we drew a number of strategies from the quality improvement literature, so managing quality. There were 16 strategies that we placed in that category. And we also had a few strategies that focused on addressing the overarching policy context of implementation. There were certainly some limitations to this original compilation, one of which was that the strategy terms and definitions that we proposed were not vetted by a wider range of implementation experts. And so, and another limitation that I would mention is that the categories that I listed before were not sort of empirically derived. That was pretty much us sitting in a room and coming up with the best thing that we could think of. And so we had an opportunity to address some of these limitations and ensure that these strategies resonated with a broader array of professionals and experts in the field. And we were approached by colleagues from the VA. Tom Walton, Joanne Kirchner, again, are the PIs of this study. And we conducted a multi-stage study called the Expert Recommendations for Implementing Change study, which is actually still going on. We're pretty much in the third and fourth stages of that study right now. But the first stage of this was to establish expert consensus on a common nomenclature for strategy terms and definitions. So the first thing that we did was engage an expert panel of participants. We used purposive sampling, again, reached out to the editorial board of implementation science, as well as the implementation research coordinators for the VA queries. And the faculty and fellows of the Implementation Research Institute, which is an NIH R25 that provides training for implementation researchers in behavioral health. Ultimately, we recruited 71 participants, the majority of whom were from the US. 90% of them had implementation expertise, and about half of them also had clinical expertise. I will also note that 2/3 of them were affiliated with the VA, which is consistent with our purpose for generating recommendations that would be appropriate for VA settings in mental health. So we engaged this group in a 3-round Delphi, which was originally seeded with our 2012 paper. And the first 2 rounds of the Delphi involved asynchronous web-based surveys to refine and extend the original compilation. So essentially, participants were given the terms and definitions from the original compilation and were allowed to comment if they had concerns or suggested changes to either the term or the definition, or if they had additional strategies to suggest that we might want to consider. So they suggested additional terms and definitions as well. Consistent with the Delphi method, after each round, that data was fed back to participants so they could consider that as they completed subsequent rounds of the survey. The third round involved a web-based polling process, which was conducted using GoToMeeting. 40 participants participated in that voting process. And we developed a structured voting procedure, which I believe we ripped off from the US Senate for lack of a more research-based way to go. But so we had a number of decision rules in terms of what to do if there were ties and so forth. And just to give you an idea of the results of that 3-round Delphi, the majority of terms and definitions from the original compilation were actually considered no contest and weren't subject to voted. So the participants largely didn't have major concerns with those definitions. 21 strategies and 5 new strategies were voted on in round 3, so people had concerns or suggested new strategies. In those cases, the alternative definition was actually ultimately selected 81% of the time, and each new strategy that was proposed was retained. So the final compilation is a 73 strategy compilation, which is published in Implementation Science. I would note, since I often overlook the additional files in these articles, the additional file 6 for this article actually has the most complete version of the compilation, which has some extra learning material that might be useful for implementation researchers and stakeholders. So the next phase of the AIR project allowed us to actually ask this other question: can we develop conceptually distinct categories of implementation strategies, and also allowed us to obtain ratings of these strategies in terms of their feasibility and importance. So we utilized concept mapping, which is an inherently mixed methods approach that involves a structured structured sorting process as well as rating tasks. And we used Concept Systems Global Max, which is a software that allows us to do that online. And essentially, concept mapping involves, on the analytic side, involves multidimensional scaling and hierarchical cluster analysis, which is ultimately used to produce visual representations of relationships between constructs, which in this case, we were primarily obviously interested in implementation strategies. So this is actually not showing up wonderfully on the slide. This is the final cluster solution that we came up with. The yellow dots that you see, which should actually be numbered, all of them, are the individual strategies. So essentially what participants did was sort the strategies into piles that made sense to them. And then through those analytic processes, a map is generated. And what you're looking at here strategies that are closer together are actually more conceptually similar, and likewise clusters that are close together are more conceptually similar. Ultimately, we settled on a 9-cluster solution, and there's some art involved in this in terms of the team actually coming up with the names for these clusters. So to give you an example of one cluster, which we named Provide Interactive Assistance, this involved 4 different discrete strategies: centralized technical assistance, facilitation, provide clinical supervision, and provide local technical assistance. So again, participants rated each of the discrete strategies in terms of importance and feasibility. What you see here is a ladder graph that presents the average ratings per cluster. And so one of the interesting things that we saw here were that utilized financial strategies and strategies that were related to changing infrastructure, some of these broader policy approaches, were actually not seen as very important and feasible. It may be that the importance rating is driven down by participants' perception that they had little control over these strategies, whereas use evaluative and iterative strategies, which include things like assess for readiness and identify barriers and facilitators, or purposely re-examine the implementation, those were seen as extremely important and feasible. This is a way of seeing actually each of the strategies on a single graph. It's called a go zone graph, and you can see here that this lower left-hand quadrant, or quadrant 3, is actually the strategies that fell below the mean for both feasibility and importance. So you can see, for instance, that started dissemination organization was not seen as a very feasible or important strategy, whereas strategies such as assess for readiness and identify barriers and facilitators and audit and feedback were seen as both very feasible and important. So it might be of particular interest to look at some of those strategies in that upper right-hand quadrant to see if any might be suitable for your implementation needs. The findings for this second stage of the ERIC project have been published in Implementation Science in this short report. And again, I would encourage you to look at the additional files, particularly if you want to see more about the methodology of concept mapping and how we actually derived the conceptually distinct categories using that process. So we hope that this compilation is useful for both practice and research. And I think for practice, we're hoping that this is something that is helpful as people identify strategies for their implementation efforts, and that they are able to build multifaceted, multi-level strategies using these discrete building blocks of implementation, essentially. This is certainly not a checklist, and so we wouldn't encourage stakeholders to use all of these. In fact, that would not be feasible or appropriate. We also hope that it's useful in similar ways for research. So we think it can be useful in developing intervention conditions for comparative effectiveness trials. We also think that it can highlight under-researched strategies. So some of the discrete strategies included in this compilation have a robust body of evidence behind them. The Cochrane reviews and the Effective Practice and Organization of Care group have many reviews for things like audit and feedback, educational workshops, and the like. But a number of them are either under-researched or will never be a part of randomized controlled trials. They're more likely to be components of multifaceted strategies. We also think it can be useful in thinking through issues of fidelity of implementation strategies. So just like clinical or public health interventions, where we would like to see fidelity to the intervention, we can think of implementation strategies in the same way. And the more we can clearly define and describe implementation strategies, the more we can think about what it would mean to have fidelity to those strategies. There are certainly limitations. First of all, our expert panel is obviously limited to North America, so a broader international audience would have been preferable and perhaps would have added additional strategies. There's also an argument that could be made that in-person meetings may have added nuance to the process. Furthermore, the compilation is not yet linked to context, theory, or evidence, and I'm going to share some studies in which we're trying to actually do precisely that, especially with respect to context and theory. So I already noted this limitation with regards to reporting standards and the lack of quality reporting in implementation research, and this is not specific to implementation strategies, but that's obviously my focus today. I think these are just quotes that I won't read verbatim from 2 systematic reviews that were chosen somewhat at random, and I think these will resonate with many of you who have read systematic reviews that have relatively inconclusive results. And oftentimes the reason for that is that, you know, the interventions or the implementation strategies in this case are not described well enough to where we can actually understand what components were effective and why. Obviously, this is not very satisfying, and so there have been a number of calls for better reporting. Susan Mickey and colleagues in 2009 put forth this editorial in implementation science, calling for better reporting and also referring specifically to the wider guidelines or wider recommendations, which is the work group for intervention development and evaluation research. And Lauren Albrecht and colleagues published what I think is a very useful checklist for the wider guidelines that you may want to check out, which is also published in Implementation Science. As a result of some of our review work focusing on implementation strategies, Enola Proctor and Curtis McMillan and I published a set of recommendations for specifying and reporting implementation strategies that I'm gonna give a few examples of here in the next couple of slides. There have also been broader efforts to call for better reporting and implementation in terms of not just strategies, but also reporting context and other factors. And I'm pointing specifically to Guy Lanetta and colleagues, the second paper here. And I think there are a number of ongoing efforts in this area. So these are, I think, things to continue to pay attention to. So in our editorial, we called for researchers to name, define, and really carefully specify implementation strategies. So hopefully naming and defining strategies in ways that are consistent with the existing literature. As I noted before, this is difficult given the inconsistent nature of the literature, but we really ask people to specify strategies, including the actors involved and the very specific actions that they're taking, the targets of the action in terms of both the individuals or the levels that they're targeting, and the specific determinants of implementation or barriers and facilitators that they're targeting. Temporality, so anything with regard to sequencing or timing that is important for the strategy, the dose or intensity of the implementation strategy, as well as the implementation outcome affected. So for each component implementation strategy or discrete implementation strategy in a multifaceted implementation strategy, what is the purpose of it in terms of an implementation outcome? Is it designed to enhance fidelity, improve the level of sustainment of a treatment or intervention? Carefully specifying those is critical. We also think one of the main missing factors in reporting is the justification for implementation strategies. So it's often not clear whether theory, evidence, or pragmatic concerns were used to select the specific components of implementation strategies. Just as an applied example, Alicia Bunger and colleagues used these Proctor et al. Guidelines or reporting standards to specify a learning collaborative strategy, which is designed to facilitate the implementation of trauma-focused CBT in mental health clinics. And so this particular strategy involved 11 component or discrete strategies, and Alicia and her team actually specified each of these component strategies in great detail. And I think what this shows is that it gives a much better understanding of what the learning collaborative actually was, how it was designed to work, and it gives us a better sense of why and how it was actually working in practice. Similarly, this is hot off the press, or I should say not yet hot off the press. Rachel Gold and colleagues have a paper that similarly uses the Proctor standards to specify implementation strategies in diabetes care in community health settings. So keep an eye out for that paper. Hopefully it's okay that I included that URL. I think it's not yet live, but should be any day now. I also wanted to point to some work that colleagues are doing to promote a simplified framework for reporting implementation strategies. And the first PDF that you see here is the result of an international meeting that they held, I believe, a few years back to develop the simplified framework for interventions. The second thing that you see in the slide is the AIMD framework, the AIMD framework down here, which is the result of their second international meeting, which was held in fall of this year. And they really ask people to specify the aims of an implementation strategy. So what do you want your strategy to achieve and for whom? The ingredients, what actually comprises the strategy, the mechanism, how do you propose the strategy will work, and the delivery mechanism. So how will the delivery actually occur? Is it face-to-face? Is it online? Is there another type of delivery mechanism? And this group is currently working on a proposal for further funding to develop this framework. I think the hope is that this will actually, along with other reporting guidelines, will actually improve the selection, evaluation, and understanding of implementation strategies. So in terms of applying implementation strategies in practice, we would hope that, again, the selection of implementation strategies would be driven by relevant theory and evidence, as well as pragmatic concerns of specific settings. I often quote Martin Eccles secondhand, who I guess has said that strategies are often selected using the Acknowledgements principle, or it seemed like a good idea at the time. And certainly we want to move away from that type of approach. Many of the process models in implementation have focused on efforts to tailor strategies to specific determinants of practice. So assessing context and identifying barriers and facilitators, and then actually selecting strategies that appropriately address them, and of course evaluating them. So I think this is a simple idea with a lot of face validity. Just some examples here. If you run into a lack of knowledge, it might be that interactive education sessions are quite appropriate. If there's a mismatch between perception and reality, so for instance, if clinicians all report that they're already delivering evidence-based practice or guideline concordant care, then audit and feedback might be an appropriate implementation strategy to use. Similarly, if there's a lack of motivation, incentives or sanctions or carrot or stick approaches might be appropriate. There have actually been a number of studies to evaluate whether tailored strategies are more effective than more standardized implementation approaches. And the results of many of those studies suggest a mismatch between the identified barriers and the actual strategies that are selected for use. So for instance, in some cases, investigators may identify organizational barriers, but then address them using primarily provider-focused implementation strategies that focus on the individual level. So leaders in the field have actually called for systematic and rigorous methods to enhance the linkage between barriers and implementation strategies. We recently published a paper in the Journal of Behavioral Health Services and Research that focused on 4 different methods that we think can actually improve the process of both assessing determinants and matching implementation strategies to address them. And I won't go into these methods in any detail, but wanted to call out the paper. And the 4 methods that we talked about were concept mapping, conjoint analysis, group model building, and intervention mapping. We're also continuing work that is hopefully extending the utility of the compilation that we developed by helping us to better link those implementation strategies to specific contextual concerns. So the first is a continuation of the ERIC study, which is to use menu-based choice methods to develop expert consensus on the types of strategies needed to implement different clinical innovations in different settings. So there are 3 high-priority interventions for the VA, specifically for mental health stakeholders within the VA, including metabolic monitoring for individuals who are taking antipsychotics, measurement-based care for depression and primary care, and prolonged exposure for individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder. And what we wanted to see is whether implementation strategies would differ for these different interventions and in different scenarios. So what we did was develop 3 different scenarios that varied according to their evidence and their context. And so obviously the specific evidence for these interventions does not change, but the settings perceptions of the evidence does change. So in some cases we suggested that, in this context, stakeholders really don't buy into the evidence. They're skeptical of it. They're skeptical of the validity of it or its applicability in this setting. In other settings, we said that people actually really buy into the evidence and think it's a good fit. Similarly, for context, we varied context according to culture, leadership, and their capacity to evaluate practice. And so we had 3 different scenarios that were really in narrative form that presented these different contexts. And what I'm going to present here is a high-level summary of the weak evidence, weak context scenario. We also asked people to consider different stages of implementation, so pre-implementation, implementation, and sustainment. And so we presented them with all 73 of the strategies and asked them to rate them according to whether it would be perceived as absolutely essential, essential, likely inessential, or absolutely inessential for each of these scenarios and for each of these stages of implementation. Again, this is just high-level findings from the week and week context. And what we see here is along the y-axis, you actually see the number of implementation strategies. And so these are the number of strategies that individuals endorsed according to each rating category. So you can see that across these 3 interventions, there were a lot of strategies that received absolutely essential rankings. So for depression and PTSD, you see between 10 and 30. Actually, the range is between 5 and 55 strategies. For safety, you see even more strategies receiving an absolutely essential ranking. When you aggregate these and actually look at the proportion receiving a majority of the ratings or greater than or equal to 50% of the ratings, we see that across these different interventions, we have at least 11 strategies that are deemed absolutely essential, but we have this large block of strategies that receive likely essential ratings. So in another view, this is the strategy level. You can see some of these strategies were consistent across interventions. So for each of the interventions, for instance, assess for readiness and identify barriers and facilitators, audit and feedback, conduct local needs assessment, facilitation, and tailor strategies were deemed absolutely essential across all of these interventions. Similarly, identify and prepare champions, conduct ongoing training were seen as absolutely essential. We also saw some strategies that were deemed absolutely inessential. So for instance, alter patient and consumer fees or change liability laws, nobody was buying those strategies as essential, and actually they received absolutely inessential ratings across interventions. So what we learned from this so far is that this menu-based choice approach was able to produce distinct recommendations for these different interventions. We were interested to find that experts endorsed a high number of strategies, and they endorsed a much higher number than is typically tested in trials of multifaceted strategies. However, I will note that in some ways this is consistent with the high number of strategies reported in real-world implementation efforts. So there's a number of publications that I'm aware of in mental health and elsewhere that reports strategy use in usual care or associated with specific implementation efforts. And oftentimes the number of strategies reported is far greater than the number reported in trials. This also may reflect an underreporting of implementation strategies in trials. So again, this could be a reporting issue in which trials focus on sort of the main strategies that are in use, but don't focus on some of these strategies that are actually supplementing them, that are either endogenous to the context or are added without specifying them. one of the things that was interesting is that participants really wanted more context. So even though we, in some ways, overwhelmed them with these scenarios and the enormity of this task, they actually wanted more context to be able to complete this task, which again speaks to the extent to which implementation is really a context-driven field. In terms of next steps, we have many analyses to complete, and so we have the phase and scenario-specific results will be forthcoming, so look out for those manuscripts. We also are interested in comparing the recommendations that we received through this menu-based choice practice, or menu-based choice exercise, to actual practice. So we're looking to our stakeholders at the VA to find out what they're actually doing in these national rollout efforts and whether their efforts are consistent with ours, and how our findings can hopefully inform them in the future, and vice versa. The other effort that we're engaged in is to actually map the ERIC strategies to the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research. If you're not familiar with the CFR, the original publication is by Laura Damschroeder in 2009 in Implementation Science. And so we're working with Laura Damschroeder and Tom Waltz and other colleagues to map the CFR constructs to the ERIC strategies. And what we did was essentially frame each of the 39 constructs within the CFR as barriers. So for instance, relative priority is one of the constructs in the CFR at the intersetting level or organizational level. And so we phrase that as stakeholders perceive that implementation of the innovation takes a backseat to other initiatives or activities. Then we asked participants to select and rank up to 7 strategies from the ERIC list that best address those barriers, or that barrier. So we emailed over 400 potential participants, 169 responded. They were randomly assigned to CFR constructs and asked again to select and rank up to 7 strategies. If they were willing to do another, we would let them go as long as they wanted to go. So we were hoping that folks would fill out at least 7 constructs. And when they were finished, we sent them to some demographic questions. Thank them for their time. What we found again was a wide distribution of endorsements. So the number of ERIC strategies ranked per CFR construct averaged 47 strategies with a range of 35 to 55. The number of respondents actually varied per CFR construct. So we ended up normalizing the number of endorsements as if the number of respondents was 20 for each of the CFR constructs. We then established tiers of endorsement based upon the quartiles. And so if at least 10 participants endorsed a strategy, we called that a Tier 1 star strategy. If 4 to 9.5 endorsed it, it's a Tier 1 strategy, and so on and so forth. So to stay with the example of relative priority, you can see here that the number of respondents for this normalized again as if there were 20 respondents for this construct is just over 9. So we had 0 Tier 1 star recommendations for this construct. We had 6 Tier 1 recommendations for this construct. So strategies such as conduct local consensus discussions, alter incentive and allowance structures, and assess for readiness and identify barriers and facilitators were seen as high priority strategies to address barriers related to relative priority. We had 18 Tier 2 recommendations and then 29 Tier 3 recommendations. So this is a view across all 39 CFR constructs, and it may be a little bit difficult to see the red bars down here, but those represent the Tier 1 star recommendations. You can see the orange bars. So for most of these constructs, we had approximately around 10 strategies that were recommended to address those barriers. So we have some level of loose consensus on the best strategies to address CFR barriers, although I think we all hoped that we would have a far narrower range of strategies that were endorsed for each of those constructs. Again, there may be a need for more more context. It's sort of hard to do this divorced from a specific implementation effort. But we hope that this provides a starting point from which to build an evidence base for barrier-specific strategies. In terms of next steps, we certainly hope to publish this study. We also are interested in developing a tool for the CFIR website, or cfirguide.org, which would actually allow stakeholders to prospectively address or prospectively evaluate barriers and facilitators using the CFIR, and then to identify the specific constructs that they would like to address. And basically, the website tool would allow us to print out a number of strategies that might be relevant to those constructs and allow participants to or users to select the strategies that they would like to use. So again, this is certainly, I think, far from perfect, but hopefully it's getting us a little bit further down the road and farther away from the Islagiat, or it seemed like a good idea at the time, approach to implementation. So I want to certainly acknowledge our support from the Department of Veterans Affairs, as well as the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, and happy to take discussion questions at this time. I almost forgot, also wanted to put in a free advertisement for the Implementation Science Exchange, which is formerly the D&I portal, which is a website that's curated by folks here, Jen Scott at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I think provides a lot of great resources for implementation research, and including grant proposals that have been funded through the NIH D&I program announcements. And so if you're not already aware of this, please check it out when you have time and interest, and happy to have to continue this discussion.
Thank you so much, Byron, for that wonderful presentation. As mentioned, we're going to now open the session for questions. As a reminder, questions can be submitted using the Q&A panel on the side of your screen. Please type your questions to the provided field and hit submit.
Okay, and so while we're waiting for some of the questions to come in, Byron, I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about how much of an effort has gone into trying to assess the level of evidence for each of the discrete implementation strategies that you looked at. Is that a next step, or is that something that the team has a good handle on at this point?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a next step. As I noted in the presentation, I think for many of these strategies, there's already a fairly robust set of evidence. So I would direct people first to the Cochrane Collaboration's Effective Practice and Organization of Care group, which conducts a lot of systematic reviews, specifically focusing on some of these implementation strategies. I think that some of the strategies, if you actually look at the compilation, are never likely to have a robust evidence. I mean, I think they are, again, going to be seen as, maybe necessary complements to other strategies, but might not necessarily be tested on their own. So it's somewhat difficult to think about the evidence for all of them. But there's certainly a growing body of evidence, and actually Jeremy Grimshaw has a paper in 2012 in Implementation Science called, I believe, the Translation of Knowledge Translation Interventions, which might be a nice place to start with for folks, because it summarizes many of the Cochrane reviews that have already been conducted and gives a sense of how robust the evidence is overall.
Great. That's really helpful. I guess along a similar line, so it sounds like the idea of having a whole set of clustered, in a sense, multi-strategy, multi-component strategies, I guess it is what you've seen most people use. Is there a way in which you would see clustering of the different strategies? I mean, in some cases you could say, well, we pick one from bucket A, one from bucket B, but are you seeing natural clustering among the different, I guess, studies that you're seeing testing the different strategies?
I'm not sure that I could say that I have seen a natural clustering. I think in addition, this is sort of a tag along to your previous question, I think in addition to developing an evidence for the discrete strategies, there is a need to develop evidence for multifaceted strategies. And so I'm not sure that I see a natural clustering. Maybe others would disagree. But I think that's sort of another critical need in terms of the development of evidence, along with what I would say is the development of the specific methods and processes by which people can actually select and tailor these strategies.
Mm-hmm. Great. And in terms of if you're thinking about downstream generations of I guess resources around implementation strategies, would you see there being help in trying to search from those strategies by specific contexts, by specific types of interventions? Is there a way in which the field, if you've got our community that's trying to figure out what strategies should we be using, is an initial cut to try and go by the kind of intervention, the kind of setting, both of those? Any thoughts about how the selection process of different strategies might be made easier, given that there's such a variety of things that people are trying to implement and settings in which those practices are being implemented?
Yeah, I think those are obviously big questions and important directions for the field. I could certainly see utility in linking strategies to context and sort of starting there. So I view sort of work that's similar to the work that we're doing to link CEPR and Eric as important in that regard, hopefully giving us a better sense, at least a starting point of if you have concerns at this sort of contextual level, these are the types of strategies that might be appropriate. Because I think what we've seen in these subsequent stages of ERIC is that there may be just a need for high-level tailoring of these implementation strategies. And so the better we can give people a sense of the match between context and strategies, I think it'll move us in that direction. I mean, and as for interventions, I mean, I think that's a bit trickier. Obviously, there are a whole host of interventions that folks are trying to implement, and I think there's some evidence that suggests different interventions will certainly require different types of implementation strategies, but it seems a little bit harder to provide generalizable guidance with that respect.
Sure. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Again, we're open for other folks to ask questions, so I don't monopolize the time. But I did have another question, and that's really actually, Byron, giving you the opportunity to ask of the group who's on the phone. Are there things that you would like folks to be thinking about, ways in which some of the other folks might participate in sort of advancing the science around implementation strategies? What would you like people to do if you now have your stage to say, we could use some help in X, Y, or Z? Any thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, I think first of all, these are sort of old concerns that continue to be an issue, but I think obviously the level at which we report and discuss implementation strategies in the literature, I think, needs to be done at a much more granular level. And so really providing as best as people can a rationale for what they're doing and why, and providing enough detail so that it can be replicated in research and practice, and also so that it can be meaningfully included in meta-analyses where that's appropriate. Another sort of ongoing concern for the field is, are we adequately integrating theory and conceptual models in our work? So the extent to which people can draw from the theories and models available now, I think that will help us understand, again, how and why these strategies are working or failing to be effective. I think those are two main things that I think of that can help us advance the field. Yeah, I may come back with more, but
yeah, and obviously I think the way in which we run these webinars, just for folks who are listening in, is to try to, this is a chance to stimulate further discussion, and of course down the line we'll have this archived on our research to reality space, but of course encourage folks to add their own thoughts over time as well. I did have one more question, and then I was going to, I think Sarah was going to just jump in and give some insight into copies of the slides. But so we've in recent months, we've seen efforts that have been looking at trying to characterize the different, and some of this you alluded to just now, the different models and frameworks that have been developed around implementation. We've talked about the different measures that in some cases have sprung forth from those models and other implementation outcomes, and then now we're talking about trying to categorize implementation strategies. How much, Byron, have you been able to connect? Do you see these as basically in a series of efforts that have logical joining points, and that the joints have already been made, or is that something that we as a field need to be thinking more about in terms of how do we take all of that work that's been done around trying to categorize different models, how do we take all of the work that you and others have done around strategies and then have that coalesce with different measures, as well as just the variety of work that's being done with research designs? How do you think we might fit all the pieces together?
It sounds like you just asked me to solve all of the problems in the field of implementation science, so I appreciate that, David.
Sure. Well, we've got 9 minutes, so we've got. Sorry. Yeah.
No, I mean, I certainly see all of those efforts as very critical independently, and I think this is maybe sidestepping your question, but I mean, I think it's a challenge in the field in general. We have a lot of people working in sort of diffuse areas and people working internationally. And so at times, I think one of the challenges is just even being aware of the work going on in a given domain. So I think in many ways, a lot of this work is happening in parallel, where it could be more effective if we were sort of joined internationally in these efforts. I certainly see value in linking the implementation strategy compilations and other taxonomies that are out there to relevant theory and evidence. And so I could see sort of from the stakeholder perspective the value of developing websites or other sort of dissemination mechanisms that would allow us to have all that information in one place. So here are the types of strategies that you could use. Here are the theories and the sort of the mechanisms, at least to the best of our knowledge, of how they may work. And here are the primary studies that have evaluated their impact, and having that in one resource would be very valuable. I mean, but again, I think you asked me to solve everyone's problems, which I appreciate. But
well, we appreciate you taking a stab at it. But I think as much of anything, it's probably either a rhetorical question or a question for all of us to try and tackle. Although your thoughts about how we can join some of these resources, I think, makes a lot of sense. There's a question that I can't see.
Oh, so Byron, I will go ahead and pitch this to you. So Kelly asks, can you comment on how the behavioral change wheel and choice of interventions aligns with ERIC and CFR?
Yeah, I can, which is we haven't really explicitly linked ERIC to the behavior change wheel or the behavior change techniques. We like to think of the behavior change techniques as almost at a more granular level. If you're familiar with that taxonomy, that they're almost at a more granular level than the implementation strategies that we discuss in our menu. And I've had some conversations with a colleague at the University of Ottawa, Justin Presseau, about sort of linking the ERIC taxonomy to the behavior change technique taxonomy to see if it would actually provide more concrete guidance about how these strategies are actually working and how they could be applied. So I think that's an area of potential future work if we decide to take it on, or if others want to take it on. But again, haven't sort of explicitly linked to either the behavior change taxonomy or the behavior change wheel.
Wonderful, thanks so much. And sort of with that, and to be cognizant of time, I want to take a moment to thank you both, Byron and David, for your time this afternoon, and for everyone who's on the line in attendance. We appreciate you joining us for these sessions and look forward to more wonderful presentations like today's. As a quick wrap-up note, your feedback is important to us, and we encourage you to complete our online evaluation. A link to the survey will be sent to you in an email shortly. Finally, as mentioned, we'd like to continue this discussion from the webinar online at researchtoreality.cancer.gov, where you can engage with the speakers and other participants through discussion posts and forums, and also locate the archive. We hope to see you at the next session in May, and thank you again for joining us today for this month's webinar. You may disconnect at this time.